Hello, I'm Benjamin Sullivan, and welcome to another episode of Ben's Tech Support. Remember this guy, the computer I call Beast? In the last episode of Ben's Tech Support, I showed you how to upgrade the memory on a desktop computer by upgrading Beast's RAM to RGB RAM, and as you can see, it's still bright and colorful. So, what should the next major upgrade on this computer be? How about the graphics card? Even though Beast already has a pretty high-end graphics card, an RTX 2080 Ti, I decided that I wanted something a little bit newer and with a little more power. So, I bought myself an RTX 3080 Ti. Unfortunately, as much as I would love to install this bad boy, that's going to have to wait for another video because we need to upgrade the power supply in this computer before I can upgrade the graphics card. So that means, in this episode of Ben's Tech Support, I'm going to show you how to upgrade the power supply unit on a desktop computer. So let me start by explaining what a power supply is, and then I'll explain why we need to upgrade the power supply before we can upgrade the graphics card. The power supply unit, also known as the power supply or PSU, is the component inside your desktop computer that takes AC, alternating current, from the electrical outlet, converts it into DC, direct current, and then distributes that power to all the components inside the computer. When you are hooking up a desktop computer, you take a computer power cable, plug one end into a surge protector, and the other end plugs directly into the back of your computer's power supply. Where exactly is the power supply located? Well, each case is a little bit different, but most of the time you will find the power supply mounted inside the case towards the rear, either at the top or the bottom. Let me show you a few examples. So right here, I have an old Dell desktop computer and the side panel has been removed so you can see inside. If we look inside, here's the power supply right here. Notice how it's mounted towards the back of the case, inside at the top. In most computer cases, this is where it is. This is one of the most common placements of a power supply, but the one that we're going to be replacing today in Beast is located at the very bottom, which you'll see in just a minute. Without a power supply, or if you have a power supply that has gone bad, your computer would not even turn on. As you can see by looking at Beast, you can see that he's up and running, so it looks like his power supply is working, right? Yes, it is. But now that you know what a power supply is, and now that you know that Beast already has a power supply that's working, you're probably wondering, why do we need to upgrade the power supply before we upgrade the video card, and why does Beast even need a new power supply if it already has one that seems to be working? There are two reasons as to why we need to upgrade the power supply. The first reason is wattage. The wattage is the maximum amount of power the power supply unit can distribute to all of the computer's components. For example, a 500 watt PSU can distribute up to 500 watts of power to a computer's components. How much wattage does a computer need? Well, there is no direct answer because it varies from system to system. It depends on how many components you have and what type of components you have, as some components, especially graphics cards, use up a lot more power than others. Generally, the more components you have in your system, the more power you are going to need. Especially if you have a high-end graphics card. Let me give you a general idea. If your computer is not a gaming computer and therefore has a lower-end graphics card, then a 500 watt power supply should be sufficient. However, if you're building a gaming system and you're going to have a lot of memory and a high-end graphics card and multiple hard drives, you're going to want at least a 750 watt. If you look online, you can find power supply calculators to help you determine exactly how much wattage you need for your system. Basically, you just input all the information for your computer's devices and the computer will give you an idea of how much power you need. I will put a link in the video description. Another option is to look up the minimum recommended wattage for your computer's graphics card and make sure that your power supply is at the same or higher. I know that the current power supply unit in Beast is a 650 watt, and I know that the current video card is an RTX 2080 Ti. So, let's go online and let's look up the requirements for both the 2080 Ti as well as the 3080 Ti to make sure I'm at least the minimum for both of them. So as you can see, I'm on Google. I'm going to type RTX 2080 Ti user guide. And this should take me to a PDF from the NVIDIA website that will give me the exact minimum system requirements. Let's click here. And it says, system power supply, minimum of a 650 watt or greater system power supply with two 8-pin PCI Express supplementary power connectors. Aha, so the minimum is 650, and we know that I'm currently running a 650. Now, let's look up the minimum power supply requirement for the 3080 Ti, the graphics card that I want to upgrade to. Okay, so I'm back at Google. Let's go ahead and look up the requirements for the 3080 this time. RTX 3080 Ti user guide. And same thing, it's going to take us to a PDF where we can look up the requirements. So we're going to go down. Here we are, system specifications, system power supply, 750 watt system power supply. Aha! So if you look right here, you can see that the 3080 Ti requires a 750 or above, and the current power supply is only a 650. So, now we know what the minimum power supply requirements are for the 2080 Ti and the 3080 Ti. The 2080 Ti requires a 650 watt, while the 3080 Ti requires a 750 watt. Since the current power supply is a 650 watt, it's right at the minimum for the 2080 Ti, but below the minimum for the 3080 Ti. So that means we need to upgrade the power supply to a higher wattage in order to run the 3080 Ti. Running a high-end graphics card with a power supply wattage that is below the minimum recommended wattage is definitely not a good idea because it can result in things like system crashes and overheating, so don't do it. So now you know the first reason why we need to upgrade the power supply before we can upgrade the video card. Wattage. We need a little bit more wattage. But what's the second reason? The second reason is because the current power supply doesn't have enough 8-pin connectors to power the new graphics card, so we're upgrading to a power supply that has more 8-pin connectors. Let me show you what I mean. Most lower-end and mid-range graphics cards, like this GTX 1050, receive enough power directly from the PCI Express slot that all you have to do is install it into its slot and it gets enough power without needing additional power from the power supply. So as you can see, this is the GTX 1050. Here's the PCI Express port. That normally you just install that in a computer into the slot and you're good to go. However, most higher-end graphics cards, like this GTX 1080, require additional power from the power supply in order to operate properly. So on this GTX 1080, if you look right here, notice how that's an 8-pin connector. So in order for this graphics card to function properly, first you install it into the PCI Express slot in your motherboard. Then you take an 8-pin power connector from your power supply and connect it to the 8-pin port right here. So let's take a quick look at the current setup I have in Beast. So here's my Beast computer. I went ahead and removed the plexiglass cover to make it easier to see on the inside. And look, there's the RGB RAM from the previous video, still bright and colorful. And right down here, we have our power supply that we're going to replace soon. And here's our current video card, the RTX 2080 Ti. And as you can see, instead of only needing one 8-pin connector like the 1080, the 2080 requires two 8-pin connectors. See, there's the first 8-pin connector and the second 8-pin connector. Now, the power supply that's currently installed only has two connectors, but the graphics card only requires two, so we're fine with this one. Now, let's take a look at the brand new 3080 Ti. Okay, I just pulled it out of the box. Here's our brand new 3080 Ti, and let's look at this. Look how many 8-pin connectors it requires. Not one, not two, but three! Three 8-pin connectors, and my power supply only has 2 available. So, how do you install a graphics card that requires 3 8-pin connectors in a computer that has a power supply that only has 2 8-pin connectors? The simple answer is you can't, unless you upgrade the power supply, which is exactly what I'm about to do. So now you know both reasons why we need to upgrade the power supply before we upgrade the graphics card. The new graphics card requires a higher wattage, so we need to upgrade it to something with higher wattage, and because it requires 3 8-pin connectors and the current power supply only has 2. You know what? There's also a third reason to upgrade. This reason is optional, but might as well go for it. The last time I upgraded hardware on this machine, if you remember, I upgraded the memory to RGB memory to give the computer a little more color and a little more flavor. So, why not do the same with a power supply? So I bought myself a Red Dragon 850 watt RGB power supply. Not only will this allow us to install the RTX 3080 Ti by increasing the wattage and giving us more than enough 8-pin connectors, but it'll also add a little more RGB color to the case. Well, let's get busy! Before we remove the old power supply and upgrade to the new power supply, I have a very serious warning I must give you. Never, and I mean never, attempt to open or repair a power supply. If you have a computer and the power supply has gone bad, the best option is to just replace the power supply. You're probably thinking, if I have an old power supply that has gone bad, as long as it's not plugged into an outlet, I can touch the internal components and not get electrocuted, right? Wrong! These power supplies inside have internal capacitors that can hold high voltages for a long time. So even if you have an old power supply that's gone bad and it hasn't been plugged in or turned on in a long time, it's possible that the capacitors still have a very high charge in them, and if you touch them, it can really hurt. So please, never attempt to open or repair a power supply. So just like in the last video when I upgraded the RAM, I'm going to have to shut this computer down, disconnect it, and bring the case over to the workstation area. Shutting down. So as you can see, the computer has been moved over to the workspace area. Now, unlike the last video where I upgraded the RAM, we shouldn't have to lay the computer on its side. We should be able to keep it in its upright position to replace the power supply. So I'm going to go ahead and show you the process of replacing the power supply. So the process should be the same on your computer. It's just the exact location of where the power supply is and exactly how the wires are run is different from case to case, but the basic process should still be the same. Okay, so let's get started. The first thing I'm going to do is remove these 4 screws to take off the side panel, so let's go ahead and start with that. So as you can see, the side panel has been removed. What I'm going to do now is turn the case, and I'm going to remove these 2 screws on the back. There's one here and one at the bottom. You can see it right here. I'm going to go ahead and remove both of these screws to take off the side panel on the other side. And now the other side panel should come right off. And the reason I had to do that is, as you can see, the wires are run through this side of the case. So as I said before, each case is a little bit different, so you might not have to do that on your case, but on my case I do, because these are all power supply cables right here. So, when it comes to replacing a power supply, obviously you have to remove the old one before you can put in the new one. So the first step to removing the old one is to unplug the power supply cables from all the devices. So let me show you where to start. So first we'll start by going inside the case. And as I showed you earlier in the video, these are the 2 8-pin connectors that connect to the video card. Let's go ahead and unplug both of these. Up here I have a Blu-ray drive that has power, so we're going to go ahead and disconnect that. And then there's two power cables that connect to the motherboard. One of them is this 24-pin connector. We're going to go ahead and disconnect this one. And then another one is right next to the CPU. Here's the CPU, and you can see there's a cable right up in here, so I'm going to go ahead and unplug this one. Okay, so we unplugged the CPU, the motherboard, the Blu-ray drive, the video card. That looks like everything on our end. Normally, if you have case fans, you would have to unplug the case fans too, but in this case, these fans are RGB fans. That means they're all connected to this RGB hub. So that means we don't need to unplug the fans, but we're going to need to disconnect the RGB hub, which is on the other side. So, other than that, everything else has been unplugged on this side. So what we need to do now is take all these power cables and run them through. If you look here, there's holes here that'll run them through to the other side of the case. So I'm going to push all of them through. And then this one up here, I know it's kind of hard to see. And the 8-pin connectors for the video card, going to push them through to the other end of the case. Okay, so on our end, it looks like we went ahead and pushed all the cables through. Here's the power supply right down here, the 650 watt power supply that we're about to pull out. So now let's go ahead and turn the case around. So now here we are on the other side of the case. We pushed all the wires through, so let's go ahead and trace all the wires down to the power supply. Because here's the power supply that we're about to pull out, but we have to make sure that all the wires are in place before we can do that. And on this end, here's where the hard drive is, the SATA hard drive, so I'm going to go ahead and disconnect this power cable as well. And then after pulling wires out, you can see right here, this is actually the wire that powers the hub for the fans, the RGB fans, so I'm going to go ahead and disconnect this one as well. Okay, so now let's look at our power supply. Here's the power supply down here, and let's make sure all the power cables that come out of the power supply are out of the way and nothing is still plugged in. And it doesn't look like it. These are all the power supply cables and nothing is plugged in, so it's safe to remove the old power supply. Let me get my screwdriver. Okay, so now we're going to look at the back of the case. So here's our old power supply right here, and it's mounted in place with these screws. So I'm going to go ahead and use the screwdriver to unscrew the power supply. Okay, and with the screws removed, the old power supply should pop right out. Let's see if it comes out. And there we go. And it popped right out. No cables left behind in the case, so the power supply, the old power supply, has been successfully removed. Okay, so the old power supply was successfully removed. That's where the old power supply was, so that means the next step is to open the new power supply, mount it in place, and then run all the wires through and plug all the components in. But first, look how dusty it is down there. Let me get a rag and some compressed air and clean this out before we put the new power supply in place. Okay, so I cleaned out all the dust, and if you look down there, that's where the 650 watt power supply used to be, and that's where the 850 watt is about to be. So let's go ahead and open up the box. Okay, I'm going to push the computer aside for right now, and let's go ahead and take a look at this box. This is the brand new power supply. 850 watt RGB power supply. That's what it'll look like when it's turned on. So here's all the wires. So basically, this is one of those power supplies where one end of the wire you have to plug into the power supply. Older power supplies, all the wires already came pre-installed and they just came out of a hole in the power supply. But with newer power supplies like this one, you have to attach each cable individually. So let's take out all the cables. And here's the power supply. Let's go ahead and take off the plastic covering. Nice. So there's our desktop computer with no power supply. And there's the brand new 850 watt RGB power supply. So our first step is to mount it in place. It's going to go right in here. So the first thing I need to do is turn the case around. Let's go ahead and do that. And then we're going to go ahead and put this right in its place. And we have to make sure the fan is facing up. When you have a power supply that's mounted on the bottom of a case, the fan needs to face up. But if this was one of the cases that had the power supply up top, we would want to mount it this way. But since it's on the bottom, we mount it this way. Okay, so we'll go ahead and put it in. And then push it in until it lines up. And then once it's in place, we're going to look at the back. We want to make sure that it's lined up with the screw holes, which it is. There's one here, and one over here, and then one down here. And then we're going to go ahead and grab our screwdriver, and it came with a little bag of screws, and let's screw it in place. Okay, so I've got the screws and the screwdriver. Let's go ahead and screw this power supply in its place. Okay, make sure all 4 screws are nice and tight. And the new power supply has been mounted in place. So now let's take another look inside the case. And there it is. The 850 watt has officially taken the spot of the 650. So when we turn it on, this should be nice and colorful right here. So now the next step is we need to take all the wires it came with, run the wires through the case, and make sure that one end is plugged into the power supply and the other ends are plugged into all the components. Now real quick, you're probably wondering why not just pull out the old video card and put the new video card in. You're probably thinking it's better to just kill 2 birds with 1 stone, right? And the answer is theoretically I could, but the problem is when it comes to upgrading components in a computer, I prefer to do one at a time, because if you upgrade multiple components at the same time and then you have a problem, then it's hard to troubleshoot because you don't know exactly where the problem is. But if you upgrade components one at a time and after each upgrade a test is successful, then you know that each new component is working properly. So that's why I want to keep the old video card in for right now, make sure that the new power supply is working and that everything is good, and then once everything is good, then I'll do the video card in the next video. Okay, so here's all of our wires that came with the power supply. So this is the motherboard one right here, so I'm going to have to undo the twist ties. Okay, so I undid the twist ties for the motherboard connector. So if you look right here, that's the 24-pin connector right there. That connects directly to the motherboard, which is right there. So that's the first thing I'm going to do is plug this end into the motherboard, right like this. And then it should line up and snap into place. Okay. Okay, now that that's plugged in place, we're going to take the other end, put it through the hole, right up here, and run it through the back of the case and then down to the power supply. Now let's turn the case around. And there it is. There's the cable that we just pushed through. It's going to come down here, and it's going to plug into the ports in the back of the power supply right down there. But right down there, that's where it's going to plug in. And there it is. You can see that the wire has been plugged in. The motherboard wire has been plugged into the power supply. I know it's hard to see with the light. So now we have to repeat the process for the processor, video card, and the hard drives. So now this cable we can tell is the CPU cable because it says right there CPU. So the CPU is right underneath the big old heatsink, and there's the connectors right up there. So we're going to go ahead and plug it in here. So it's been plugged in. We're going to run the other end through that hole right up there in the corner. And pull it through. And here it is coming down here. and we're going to plug it into the power supply. And there we go. So now the motherboard and CPU cables are connected to the power supply. Let's do the video card cables next. And the same process for the video card. So there's our old video card, which only needs 2, but we need to have 3 8-pin connectors for the new video card. And the old power supply only had 2, but the new power supply will allow us to support up to 4. So let's go ahead and do the same thing. Here's the PCIe cable that's used for the video card. So there's 2 connectors here. Let's plug both of these in. Both are plugged in. Now we're going to go ahead and, same as before, run the wire through to the back of the case. And here it is. Pull it through and plug it into the power supply. So that's all we need for this video card, but since we're upgrading to a new video card that's going to require one more, we're going to go ahead and run one more PCIe cable through. Okay, so I went ahead and ran the second PCIe cable through. It'll just rest in the case for now, but this one will be used when we upgrade to the new video card. So that takes care of providing power to the major components, the motherboard, the CPU, and the graphics card. Now, we need to make sure we supply power to the fans, because we don't want the case overheating, and then we also need to make sure we provide power to the Blu-ray drive and the hard drive. So let's go ahead and do that next. So this power supply came with 2 different cables that have SATA connectors, and that works because we're going to run both of them. One of them is going to power the solid-state hard drive and the fans. The other one is going to power the Blu-ray drive. Let's go ahead and do the Blu-ray drive at the top first. Okay, there's the Blu-ray drive. Going to plug the power cable in. Okay, that's been plugged in, so now I'm going to run it through to the back of the case and pull it through. And let's plug it in. Okay, so this is the last cable that we need to connect to the power supply, and this one should be easy because we do not need to run it through the case. These are just SATA connectors, and one of them is going to power the solid-state drive, which is right here, and the other one is going to power the hub for the fans, which is right here. So that means we just need to plug one end into the power supply, and the other 2 ends will go right here, so we don't even need to run it through the case. So let's start by doing this end first. We'll plug this into the power supply. Okay, so that end is connected to the power supply. And this one right here we will use to power the solid-state drive right here. Okay, power cable connected to the SSD, and now we'll use this one to connect to the hub for the fans, and then that should be the last one. Okay, everything is installed, so we're just going to go ahead and tuck these cables into the open space in the case. Put the side panels back on, hook it up, and see if it works. Okay, all the wires have been tucked inside the case. Let's put the side panel on. And let's put the plexiglass case back on. And now let's bring this big guy back over to his home and hook him back up. And now to hook it all back up. Okay, so as you can see, Beast has been brought back to his home and has been hooked back up. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it on for the first time since installing the new power supply. If I installed the power supply successfully, not only will it still boot up and everything will work as before, but it'll also add a little more color to the case. So let's give it a go. I'm going to turn it on. It works! I can see the new light in the new power supply. Let's make sure it boots up first. ASUS, okay, so far so good. It might be a little hard to see the light down there, but I'll bring the camera closer in just a second. Let's make sure it boots and I can get into Windows. As long as it shows that all my files are still there, and as long as the Blu-ray drive is still working, then we're good to go. Okay, we're booting into Windows. As you can see, the fans are still working, so looks like everything is still good. Let's check the drive, the Blu-ray drive. It looks like it's connected still. Okay, so it looks like it was a success. Let me bring the camera closer so you can see the light better. Okay, let's get a closer look at the computer with the new power supply. So there's the power supply at the very bottom. Look at that. Isn't that pretty? And it goes well with the other two fans and the RAM too, doesn't it? And of course, can't forget the speakers. There's colored lights on the speakers and the keyboard too. So, as you can see, the installation of the new power supply was an absolute success. Not only is it working properly, but it added a little more light and color to the case, it added some more wattage, and now we have extra PCIe connectors so that now we can install the new video card. And as I said earlier in the video, I could have installed this at the same time, but I like to do components one at a time just to make sure everything is working. Then it makes troubleshooting easier if you have an issue. So the next video will be installing this expensive brand new 3080 Ti. I better be careful with this. Gotcha! It was just the empty box. Well, thank you very much for watching this video. If you like what you see, please feel free to subscribe. Have a great day, YouTubers!